I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Cuba and Fidel Castro. I'm joined by an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Although, in fact, on this subject, I'm probably more on the expert side than the amateur, because I had the great honor and privilege over 3-4 decades, actually, of spending hundreds of hours in the company of Fidel Castro, who has just died at the age of 90. I say just died, but in truth, and I know that this is often said on the death of big people, in truth, Fidel Castro has not died. He lives on in the hopes and minds and in the hearts of hundreds of millions of people around the globe, in Cuba, in Latin America, but as far away as Africa, Asia, and beyond. He was a truly gigantic figure, not just metaphorically, but also physically. He was a huge man, a powerful man in every respect. And he has, in my opinion, written his name in the stars and will never be forgotten. He joins the small band of people who can be recognized instantly across the world just by their image, or known throughout the world just by their first name. If you approach anyone in almost any continent on the globe and speak about Fidel, everyone will know who you are talking about. He was a gigantic figure historically. To spend time with him was to know just exactly how gigantic, how many gigantic issues and episodes at which he was at the center. But to get a true appreciation of Fidel Castro, we have to look back to what Cuba was like before the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 under the leadership of Fidel Castro and others like Che Guevara, like Camilo Cienfuegos, like Raúl Castro, who is now still the president of Cuba. Frankly, and I don't want to be over insulting to the Cuban people, but Cuba was a bordello for the worst people in the United States of America. It was a casino, a bordello, a playground for the criminal classes, the mafia, and organized crime in the United States, and those politicians that they had in their pockets, and they were many. The truth is, apartheid was practiced on a grand scale in Cuba. There was mass immiseration, poverty amongst the people on the island. Life expectancy was low, child mortality was high, and literacy was virtually non-existent for the mass of the population. All of that transformed under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Now, the 90 years that he lived might seem like a splendid example to all of us. We all hope to reach the age of 90. You've got more chance of doing so in Cuba than you do in the United States of America, because life expectancy in Cuba is longer than it is in the United States of America. Child mortality, your child surviving birth and infancy, is much higher in Cuba than it is in the United States of America. And Cuba has a health system entirely free to every person on the island, which is comparable not to the United States, but frankly to the much better health services in Europe. Even on the Scandinavian comparison, Cuba comes out top. Its people have enjoyed a prestige in the world under the revolutionary government established by Fidel Castro that could never have been dreamt of before the triumph in 1959. Cuba was a small island, just the distance from Edinburgh to Glasgow, away from the United States itself, and as I say, a plaything for the worst elements of the United States. Nobody in the rest of the world had really ever heard of it. Now Cuba is famous everywhere. It's probably the coolest place on the planet. If you were to take a poll as to which country most people who haven't visited it would like to visit, you'd find Cuba right up at the very top. And that's not just because of the great triumphs in the transformation of the lives of ordinary Cubans. And it's the reason why we are interested in this audience across the Arab world in Fidel Castro today. It's internationalism. Cuba has entered itself into the annals of some of the most significant political events of the 20th and 21st centuries. Well, one of the reasons why the people in South Africa were mourning the death of Fidel Castro is not as well known as it should be. The apartheid forces of the apartheid system in South Africa were armed and supported by virtually all of the Western countries. It's important to remember that now, because once Nelson Mandela came out of prison, you'd have thought that Britain and the United States and others had always been against his incarceration. But I'm not particularly an old man. I watched the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. I saw her lips move, and I heard these words come from her lips. Nelson Mandela is nothing but a terrorist. Western governments supported apartheid, but Cuba helped to bring apartheid down, leaving the blood and the bones of its soldiers on the battlefields of Angola. They defeated the army of the apartheid regime and rapidly hastened its demise, its collapse. Che Guevara fought with the greatest of all African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, in the Congo when imperialism overthrew him and drowned his country in blood and handed it to the worst dictator in history, the crook, the thief, the grand larcener, Mobutu Sese Seko. They were there, the Cubans, fighting to defend Lumumba. The Cubans were fighting in Vietnam to defend Vietnam against American aggression and invasion. The Cubans were fighting on the tiny island of Grenada. Not Cuban soldiers in this case, but building workers who happened to be building an airport for the Grenadian people when Ronald Reagan invaded a British Commonwealth country without even telling Her Majesty the Queen that he was intending to do so. The Grenadian forces were crushed, but the Cuban building workers continued to fight the US Marines until the last man. Cuba was involved in every fight for good and against every evil everywhere that it could in the world. A tiny country of 11 million people under permanent siege from day one from the United States, its gigantic and powerful neighbor. And yet, as they say, and as other countries have found out, necessity is the mother of invention. The siege on Cuba, the embargo on Cuba, has led to a situation where all kinds of fantastic, wonderful things have developed in Cuba that would not otherwise have done, like the entire biomedical sector, which is now a world leader. Cures, vaccines, inoculation against all kinds of diseases have emerged from this tiny third world country. My last words on it for now are this. Compared to other third world countries, no one can deny Cuba's achievements. And that's what should be borne in mind. Cuba was nothing, and now it very definitely is something. And the reason for that is the leadership of the Cuban Revolution, and in particular, the maximum leader, Fidel Castro. That's my take, but this is كلمة, and that means everybody here has a free word. And whether they agree with me or not, I want them to speak it. So let's hear from the gentleman in the front row. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, George. As you just highlighted, Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela were two friends who fought on the same side, fought the same battle, even literally at one point in Angola, as you said. And when Nelson Mandela passed away, a lot of hypocrites came out of the woodwork to cry crocodile tears for his funeral. Why didn't any hypocrites do that for Fidel Castro?
Well, Castro and Cuba is a real threat, not a military threat or an economic one. It's the threat of a good example. It's the threat that things can be different, that a different kind of country, a different kind of world is possible. Cuba is a threat to the idea that small countries must be dominated by big ones, that small countries cannot have an independent policy, cannot plough their own furrow, make their own course. And in those respects, they don't want to encourage Cuba or other countries to take the Cuban path. It used to be the, if you'll forgive the pun, the lingua franca in Latin America, that the United States was intervening here, there, and everywhere to stop them going the way of Cuba, to stop their children living longer, to stop their children being educated, entirely free from kindergarten to PhD, entirely free. We don't even have that ourselves. So this is an example that had to be crushed, and they failed to crush it. So by and large, once it became clear they were not going to crush it, they preferred to ignore it. But I've been reflecting, like you, on why the British media, I don't know about European media, but the British media and the American, North American media was so bitterly rancorous on the death of Fidel Castro. And I put it down to this. It's just my way of thinking. Cuba represents the idea of the collective, of us, rather than me. It represents the idea of always, rather than the idea of now. The West believes in me and now, and Cuba under the revolution believes in us and always. And that, of course, creates things. I'm sure the gentleman sitting next to you will point some of them out. That means that some people don't have freedoms in Cuba that they would have in the West. You don't have the freedom to just set up a business and hire people and exploit them and make profit from them. You have to go through quite a few channels to be able to do that, though it is increasingly possible to set up businesses. But that's because Cuba believes in us and always, and collectivism. And that's an ideological question. In fact, if you think about it, it is the fundamental ideological question. Do we want a world of atomized individuals and their so-called freedom to do whatever they like? Though if you turn up at the Ritz without the money to pay, or Frank, you wouldn't get in the Ritz because you're not wearing a tie. If you turn up at the Ritz, which you're free to do, if you don't have the money to buy the tea there, which is about £11.50, by the way, for a cup of tea, because I've been there, that's one kind of freedom. And it's true, there's no Ritz in Cuba. But what there is a conception that we will do this together, and that we will stand or fall together on it, and that we will share the proceeds, such proceeds as there can be. So that's the reason why there was no crocodile tears. But there were real tears all over the world. real tears. Charlie, I teed you up perfectly.
Thank you, George.
Charlie Wolf, an American Republican abroad, a very eloquent one. Go on.
I know this is one area where we're not going to probably agree too much. I still find that you have to look at the man for what he was, and unfortunately, I don't think he was a very nice man. I think he was essentially a criminal and a thug. And I've heard from the experience, you've met the man, I haven't, but listening to people who were Cubans in America whose parents were jailed, beaten, tortured, etc. under the Castro regime was probably the most powerful thing I heard in the last couple weeks after Fidel died. I do know that you talk about share and share alike in the collective, whereas Fidel was worth some $4 billion, I believe, according to Forbes a couple of years ago. Numerous mistresses, was essentially a thug. And to me, freedom is still everything. The collective, the problem with the collective is I'm forced to live the collective. I just comes to mind one quick line from The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And I can't remember the name of the character. The guy who was the publisher turned to Howard Rourke and he said, Howard, if you fell over the side of this boat, I would jump in and try and save you. I would die for you, but I cannot live for you. And I think that's the problem with the collective system you speak about, that you're trying to get others to do their salvation for them, if I can put it in such a term. And, listen, you're well-meaning in wanting to see a nice Cuba, healthcare, etc. But I still think the cost of what it was to the average Cuban. And I'll just end with how I used to end my phone calls on Talk Sport Radio, where we both worked years ago. There was a chap who used to always call and promote Cuba. And I always ended with the one line. I said, well, tell me how many people are swimming from Miami to Havana as opposed to the other way around.
Well, first of all, the only torture there is in Cuba is in your illegal military base called Guantanamo Bay. Secondly,
not illegal, but
it's entirely illegal. It's not wanted by the Cuban people or their government, which is why they tear up the check for the rent that you send.
But we
every
do lease
year.
it. We have a legal lease.
Secondly, I think maybe thirdly, not only is Fidel Castro not in possession of 4 billion, or 4,000, or 400, or $4, Fidel Castro had not a penny. I know that because I sat on a television dais with him on the day that the Forbes magazine article was published. And he said, if anyone can show $1 single in my possession, in any bank account, anywhere in the world, I will not just resign my office, I will take out my gun and shoot myself dead live on Cuban television. It is the most absurd canard to say that Fidel Castro is worth $4 billion. What would he do with it? He only ever wore a uniform or a shell suit. He never left Cuba except on political business. He had no car. He had no house. He earned exactly the same as any other functionary in the government. And that was the only income that he had. And the Cubans that you've met in America are the people who owned and worked in the bordellos and the casinos and the other playground paraphernalia of the criminal class that I was talking about. Of course they hate Castro.
These were human rights campaigners.
He turfed them out of their bordellos.
These were human rights campaigners.
Human rights camp. Why weren't they campaigning for human rights in Chile, where you installed a dictator who massacred tens of thousands of people? Look, it's a human right for your child to survive infancy. It's a human right to live a long and healthy life. It's a human right to have a roof and a job and a guaranteed 3 square meals, which most third world countries can only dream of. There are restrictions on human rights. I've got to tell you something, Charlie. When we stood alone against Hitler, when the American people were watching the war on newsreel, and when nobody else came to our aid, we stood alone here with Hitler 22 miles away in the Channel ports. There weren't many human rights available to supporters of Hitler in Britain at that time. There were no elections even in Britain at that time. We stood alone against the barbarian just miles away, 22 miles in our case, 70 miles in the case of Cuba to the US. Of course there are restrictions on human rights in Cuba because your country, 10 presidents in a row, 10 of them, tried hundreds of times to assassinate the leaders of the Cuban Revolution. You invaded the country, you subverted it, you subjected it to international terrorism, you besieged it, you quarantined it. Frankly, it's a miracle that civil society developed in the way that it did in Cuba, in a country under such siege. We can discuss human rights and restrictions on economic and political freedom. I'm saying to you that it's a miracle that the freedoms that do exist in the circumstances. But I am absolutely clear that the vast majority of the Cuban people mourn the death of Fidel Castro. The vast majority of the people of Latin America mourn the death of Fidel Castro, and he'll be remembered when the names of those 10 presidents who tried to kill him are long forgotten. But there'll be much more from you and from me and from the rest of you in the rest of the show. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but talking about Cuba. We took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to ask people what they thought on the demise of Fidel Castro.
What is the legacy of Fidel Castro?
He has a pretty mixed legacy.
I don't support all of his ideas, all of or his ways of conduct, but he was a great leader. He fought for his country, for his people. He brought a lot of good stuff like healthcare.
He also has created a more dictator regime in Cuba. I think it's caused a lot of conflicts, at least, with immigrants. We've seen a lot of that immigrants coming up, especially to the southern United States.
Revolution and just rebel against the U.S. also.
Healthcare, social programs, race relations in Cuba are probably better than anywhere in South America.
Should the Cuban people opt for closer relations with the West?
I think that definitely they should. Again, relating back to the more globalized society, I think it's really good for all of us, especially Cuban people, especially with the resources and trade.
I think a lot of Cuban people do want closer relations with the West, particularly for economic reasons.
I think it could improve quality of life, maybe, but I don't know the outcome. I'm saying that could be a positive outcome.
Should the Cuban people opt for closer relations with the West?
Not necessarily.
Often close relations with West means West oppression, which is not good, especially for a small country like Cuba. And that is something Castro fought over 50 years for.
Well said, that man. He seemed to have a Russian accent, I must say. Let's hear from the lady in the front row.
My name is Mary Valverde. I'm an educationalist, and I heard a lot about Fidel, and I know that Fidel will stay with us forever. One of the greatest things that Fidel did was improving the literacy across Cuba, and that had a huge impact, not only in Latin America, but in the entire world. So Cuba in 1961 has the biggest literacy campaign in the world, and many countries copied that campaign. And what he did is he sent thousands of people at the outskirts of Cuba, and those people instruct those Guajiro peoples who couldn't read or write. And he improved the literacy in Cuba from 40% to 96% in 1 year. So we need to follow that example. I'm from Peru. And I would like to see my people there, who is still now, I think, between 8 and 10% of illiterate people in Peru. And I would like to reach those Quechua and indigenous people and work with them and teach them how to read and write. We need to follow Fidel's example.
And many people have. And of course, Cuba exported. Its biggest export was not tobacco or rum. Its biggest export was doctors. And those doctors are to be found very far and wide. And by the way, those doctors come from the masses of the people, unlike doctors in most Western countries. I tell the story, I think it's a good one, of a friend of mine who picked up in his car to give a lift home 2 black women cane cutters in a very far-flung part of Cuba where tourists were never found. And the black woman cane cutter with a machete over her shoulder said to my friend, "It's good that foreigners are coming to this part of Cuba now. Mind you," she said, "many Cubans from here are now going abroad." And John Bevan, my friend who was driving the car, fluent Spanish speaker, said, "Oh really?" She said, "Yes, my daughter is a doctor and is working abroad in poor countries." Now, let me run that past you again. The daughter of a black cane cutter was a doctor and working in poor countries. In every other third world country, the daughter of a black cane cutter would be a cane cutter, not a doctor. Let me just pass the microphone around. Who else would like to say? Yes, brother.
Thank you, George. Actually, well thought-provoking session. And this is Mokhles Chowdhury, the former advisor to the President of Bangladesh and researcher, editor and analyst. My point is that Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro, just said that next session of Cuban National Assembly would pass a law fulfilling his brother's desire that once dead, his name and his likeness would never be used on institutions, streets, parks, or other public sites, and that births, statutes, and other forms of tribute would never be created. My point is that I am asking you, do you think that there will be legacy? With Castro's passing, will his legacy end with him? Number one. And number two is that there is a discussion what Castro's death and Trump's election mean for Cuba's economic awakening. Will Trump's administration reset relations with Havana, as Trump is saying that he will recast his foreign policy to many countries? Thank you very much.
Well, Donald Trump was trying to build hotels and other leisure and entertainment facilities in Cuba under the embargo before President Obama very marginally relaxed that. So if it was good enough for Trump in the old days, I can't imagine in the end that it will be different in the days that are to come. Trump is a businessman. And there's good business to be had in Cuba, particularly in the tourism sector, because so many people want to go there. The experience of going to Cuba is rather better, I must tell you, than the experience of going to Miami. You'll be lucky to emerge from the car park at the airport in Miami without being robbed. You will never be robbed in Cuba. You will never be attacked, assaulted, God forbid, raped or murdered in Cuba. But you stand a very high chance of being so in Miami. So Cuba is, as a tourist destination, of course, a real magnet. And I believe that many American businessmen, like Donald Trump, would like to be involved in it. So notwithstanding the noises off, it's my expectation that relations between the US and Cuba will continue to normalize. But there's a very long way to go. To my absolute astonishment, I learned just a couple of weeks ago that there are still companies, indeed countries, that are paying multi-billion-dollar fines to the United States for the crime of trading with Cuba. The French state bank, BNP, recently paid $8 billion in fines to the US for trading with Cuba. I was astonished at these numbers and checked them out, and they do check out. And this kind of extraterritoriality of the US arrogating to itself the right to fine a French bank for trading with a third country is, of course, a monstrosity, and one that will have to end. I believe that the Cuban people will never surrender their gains. They do, Charlie indicated it, there's a section of the Cuban population that would rather take their chances in the rat race in Miami, of course. Trust me, if you landed an American aircraft in the part of Glasgow that I used to represent in Parliament and said, get on board and here's a green card and you can go and live in Florida, the plane would be full quite quickly, actually. But the great mass of the Cuban people know that what they have, nobody else in countries like theirs has. They might want more, they might want better, but they're not going to give up that which they have got. Madam.
The legacy you haven't said.
The legacy
of Fidel Castro.
Oh, the legacy is clear to me. It's a legacy of independence. It's a legacy of saying it doesn't matter how big you are, how close you are, how powerful you are not us and we are not you. And we will defend our national independence and sovereignty and right to plough our own course in human history. And I think that will be the legacy, the number one legacy. It's not socialism, it's not communism, it's independence and sovereignty. Madame.
First of all, I'd like to send our love to all the Cubans, for they are going through a very complex process of grief, bereavement, as well as understanding the complexities of change of identity and the transformation that they're going through. I think many people in the world are concerned with many different areas of conflict, but also we have to take into consideration that the legacy of not just one man, but an entire group of people who attempted to be different than most people in the world is a wonderful legacy to examine, because those 4 points, mortality rate, education, health, and child mortality rate, makes an enormous difference to the whole population of the world. So I think learning the lessons from what they got it right, and I think they got it wrong too, and so did I, and so did most of us, and so have our ancestors, you know, we send their love back to us as acceptance. In 8,000 years' time, we'll be the ancestors of future generations. And we call upon each one of us, what legacy have we left? So I think part of the legacy is the collectivism that have existed. Right and wrong, there were areas in which, yes, there were infringements of human rights, there were problems. And I come from Brazil. My name is Marcia Mar. I'm an artist. And I was a political activist during the mid-'80s when we had to actually have our independent way of being blossoming on our own accord rather than being interfered with. So this amazing transformation that a particularly small place in the world, a particular number of people were able to go through, cannot disappear all of a sudden, but yet be learned and spread about what works, because all over the world we all want the mortality rate of children to be reduced radically, the health care of our beloved ones when they're ill to be attended to and assisted in a way that we find to be the most honorable one. And we want also education. We, you know, what does correspond to illiteracy, poverty, you know, to more conflict, crime, devastation, and we don't want any of that. So the solutions that we found together, or locally all over the world, putting together is what we have to find for the world now. It's just to pick and choose. What is it that works? Put together. Pharmaceutical industry, competitive, is not working. It's killing people. So how can we communalize the pharmaceutical industry all over the world for the people, for the benefit of the people, which will extend our lives radically? like they did in Cuba. The mortality rate and then the life expectancy and quality of life has radically changed for many people. And thank them for what they have done right. And Castro was one of them who attempted to be different.
Well, that's a very powerful, poetic, and beautiful summary. I only make this caveat. It's more than a caveat. It's a point of difference between us. You said we all want infant mortality rates to fall, but truthfully, we don't. There are people who want their own levels of child mortality to be low, but they're not ready to pay the price of your child's chances of life being enhanced. That's the difference between me and us, between now and always, that I tried to make as the dichotomy at the beginning. There are people, even in this audience, I'm not naming names, Charlie, who believe that it's each of our individual responsibilities to look after ourselves, to look after our own children. And there are people in this audience, certainly me, who believe that I have as much of a duty towards your children as I do towards my own, and that I must pay the price for, not just a financial price, political price. I must pay the price for a solution to problems of hunger, high levels of infant mortality, low life expectancy. I must pay the price so that we can all collectively, as one people, improve these things. And there are others who don't believe that, who believe in the privatization of humanity, the atomization of humanity. Or as Mrs. Thatcher put it, she said, there is no such thing as society. There is only individuals and families. Well, that is a point of view. That is an ideological current. For a time, it was quite ebullient. But it is no longer. And Cuba confronted that current, and I believe triumphed over it. But there's more to come after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, here on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Fidel Castro and Cuba, and what he meant, not just for his own people, but for people everywhere. We took the camera out onto the streets of London and got one or two surprising responses. Take a look at this.
Was Fidel Castro right about the US meddling in Latin American affairs?
I'm not entirely sure about that.
Yes, he was.
I think it was justified, yeah.
Was Fidel Castro right about the US meddling in Latin American affairs?
I think from certain points of view it can be argued.
I feel that they have meddled in US politics. I mean, if you look at Argentina, if you look at Chile, they've always had a hand in that.
Is Trump going to rewind the clock in US relations with Cuba?
I definitely think he has the potential to do that. Again, it is to be seen. He hasn't been as great in conversation of Cuba as I believe he has been, at least as of now, on the relationship with Mexico.
Again, I think how the Trump presidency is going to evolve is important for every country.
Is Trump going to rewind the clock on US relations with Cuba?
I don't think he's necessarily going to rewind the clock, but I do think that he will essentially drag out the process. So Obama, basically tried to normalize relations and tried to sort of bring Cuba into the fold. I think Trump will basically sort of put the whole policy on ice.
I don't know, we'll have to see.
I think it's very hard to predict the future when it comes to Trump's decision making.
Well, on that, I think that latter point we can probably agree. It's not certain, Isaac, is it, what way Trump will take relations with Cuba, or indeed many other parts of the world. What's your contribution initially to the discussion we've been having?
Regarding the question of Trump, first of all, I don't like that people said he's the president of the Americans, because I am an American and the majority of the Americans are outside the United States. We are from Latin America and we are most pieces of America than the USA. It's like Germans said they're Europeans, no? Second thing is, I think that Trump is the most undemocratic president in the entire history of the world. He lost the election by almost 3 million votes. I don't know any president in world history that was defeated by 3 million votes by the other rival and still be president in a direct election. Never. I think that Trump is going to have a lot of problems inside. And regarding Latin America and Cuba, I think that Trump is going to be very hostile, much more hostile than Obama, because Obama tried to make peace with Chavez, with Evo Morales, with Correa, with Raúl Castro, but Trump is going to be very hard. He even suggests that he's going to invade some countries to arrest some corrupt presidents or some corrupt politician, albeit he's much more corrupt politician than any other person that I know. I think that he's going to be very tough on Cuba. And I think that we are going to start to have more polarization in Latin America. Trump may be a man that starts to promote coup d'etats. We already see coup d'etats in Brazil, in Paraguay, in Honduras, and we don't know which kind of coups the Republican Party will do another time. I'm also very worried about the situation of Cuba because the United States is trying to push Cuba to return to capitalism. And it's very important that Cuba don't follow that path, because if Cuba returns to free market, it will be a catastrophe for the entire planet. It will be very bad for workers all over the world, for human rights everywhere.
Well, isn't the flaw in what you've just said that all of these things have been happening under President Obama? All these, the coup in Brazil, the coup in Argentina, the ongoing slow motion coup in Venezuela, they all happened under President Obama, not under President Trump. What's the reason for imagining that they'll be worse under Trump?
Well, first of all, in Argentina, we didn't have a coup. What we have is a right-wing election. But in Venezuela, yes, he's supporting a kind of coup. But
he designated Venezuela as a terrorist entity.
Yes, it's true, but Obama tried to make some agreements with them, and he doesn't promote invasions or wars. But the Republican Party, by tradition, is a party that finances the Contras, that promotes insurgencies, and I am afraid that the Republican parties will try to organize armed confrontations in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, against Cuba. I think that Trump is going to be even tougher than Obama, much, much more tougher than Obama, no?
Of course, the last American administration to invade Cuba, the last United States administration to invade Cuba was a Democratic one at the Bay of Pigs.
It's true, but if you see, I don't defend the Democratic Party, but if you see, normally the toughest presidents are the Republicans.
No, personally, I think this is a false dichotomy. All the 10 presidents tried to kill Fidel Castro, and it made no difference whatsoever whether they were Republican or Democrat. Secondly, Trump's whole shtick is that he's going to be involved in less wars. It was not him that invaded Iraq. It was not him that invaded Syria or destroyed Libya. And his shtick is that all these invasions have been a disaster.
But he's preparing an aggression towards Iran. he's going to destroy the agreement with Iran. So Iran is very worried that
I strongly advise him not to invade Iran. He'll get more than a bloody nose if he invades Iran. Charlie, you don't speak for the Trump administration. More fool them. They'd be better to hire you to do so. But go ahead.
Well, first off, just a couple minor points. We don't call him the President of America. He's the POTUS, the President of the United States. So we don't claim anything beyond our borders. Also, just to explain, we have an electoral college because we are 50 sovereign states. So it's not based on a popular vote. It's almost like when you see these polls that go around years ago, who should succeed the Queen? Should it be Prince William or Prince Charles? Well, there's a system in place for a reason, and in our system, it is the Electoral College. And that's because if you went by a popular vote, all someone would have to do is get maybe Los Angeles, Dallas, New York City, and the little states wouldn't count. So there's a reason behind it. I just wanted to point out, though, in your last segment, you were talking quite a lot about the capitalist system and the free market. Now, I would argue that actually nothing has probably improved the world more in the last, say, 100 years than the free market system. If you talk to Deirdre McCluskey, the economist who's on the Learn Liberty site on the web, on YouTube, talks about when the entrepreneur class in the late 1800s was finally respected. And I'll just use one example. In the fact of, you think of how many people all over the world, in the poorest of countries, have phones and computers. Well, this was because it was developed, of course, in the free market system. And that's where we've improved the world. The United States, I mean, again, has given food and supplies beyond what people can imagine all over the world. North Korea, we supply most of their wheat. So I would suggest that capitalism is not dead. And again, I think it's a very important system. And thankfully, I think it's made the planet a lot richer and people a lot better off than they would have been. I think the poorest people in America now are probably richer than the richest people in this country of 100 years ago because of this free market system.
Well, I mean, I just reject that conceptually, but I don't want to divert our debate overly. I just make 2 points to you. 150 million children in the world go to work instead of school, but none of them are in Cuba. 0 are in Cuba. The notion that capitalism has liberated more people in the world than any other system is dispelled in the statement of one word: China. China in the last 30 years has lifted more people out of poverty into prosperity than any system in any country has ever done. This is an undeniable fact. Now, you may counter that China's system is some kind of synthesis of socialism and capitalism. I would
You look at the dichotomy between, say, Hong Kong and the cities and the people on the farms who aren't doing so well.
I mean, you're just wrong, Charlie. At least 500 million people, 500 million people that were living in poverty in China 30 years ago are now not living in poverty. No other system can compare with that transformation. Now, there's a price in political freedoms, there's a price in human rights, but if you want to swap economy horror stories, trust me, I'm going to win on this one. But let's not you and I monopolize it. Let's pass the microphone back. There's a young man next to you, Charlie. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, my name's Amir Apollonari. I'm a Goldsmith student, and my question involves the arts in Cuba, which of course were at the absolute pinnacle. That you had theatres which were available for I think around 30 pence, that people could go along and see it, whereas in a country like the UK, most of the theatres will cost you about £20 to get in.
Or £100.
I think, or £100, yeah, it depends on which ones you want to go to, of course. I think also the development of the arts in schools, so say people like Carlos Acosta, the ballet dancer, who was from an impoverished background and was still able to go to a top quality dance school without having to pay, and was able to become a worldwide star. Do you think that in the wake of Castro's death that the arts in schools will move in the way that the USA and the UK have towards becoming, you know, something as a novelty? And the other thing in schools is, how should Fidel Castro's legacy be taught? Like, should he be taught as, you know, a sort of godlike figure, or someone to aspire to be, or someone who is part of the past, whereas they need to move on and keep developing what Castro wanted to do?
He won't be celebrated at all. As Brother Muklas said, they're going to pass a law in Cuba to forbid people from elevating the image or the name of Fidel Castro into any kind of personality cult, which I think is something very noble, actually. He will be remembered in people's hearts and minds, of course, and other dead heroes are remembered. The person whose face you will see in Cuba more than any other person is not Cuban. Che Guevara is everywhere in Cuba, but he's not Cuban. Every year, everyone must go to water and throw flowers in the water to remember Camilo, who was one of the principal commandantes in the Revolutionary War. Fidel has banned this for himself in his last will and testament, and I think that that speaks very highly of him. In a way, though, he doesn't need a picture or a statue. The cultural points you made are so important, and you made them very beautifully. The national preoccupation of Cuba, a poor third world country, is ballet. All working class people are infatuated with ballet. Dame Alicia Alonso, who I had the great honor to know well, is one of the world's principal ballerinas. And every night in Cuba, you can see the queues of ordinary workers queuing to get into the ballet. It's £100, if it's not £200, to go to Covent Garden and watch that level of cultural performance, which is, of course, even leaving aside the price. My parents, the people I grew up amongst, would never dream of going to a ballet or an opera, because they didn't consider that that culture had anything to do with them. So will it survive? Well, it depends if socialism survives. I believe that it will. And that's why I believe that socialism is a higher form. I mean, I agree with Charlie. Capitalism was necessary for a time, and it achieved phenomenal growth. But it's so last century. It's Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Cuba. Yes, go ahead, sir.
I am a trade union activist, and I would like to ask here in London the rights of the workers, because the working class here in UK, they are marginalized. I am in contact with TUC and with CGTP from Portugal. There are companies that they don't discount for insurance, they don't pay minimum wages, they have not contracts, and above all, in catering and, for instance, cleaners, and we never ever seen the slavery that we see nowadays. And I would like that you answer my point.
Well, of course, there are freedoms that exist in Cuba that don't exist here, and there are freedoms that exist here that don't exist in Cuba. You have to make a scientific evaluation of the relative value and weight of those freedoms. I am free to set up a business here in Britain. I would not be free to set up a business in Cuba. I would not be free to employ you at below the minimum wage in Cuba, but I certainly would be free to do so here, and millions are so employed. So there are swings and roundabouts in this picture. I just say, I mean, Charlie made the point earlier that the problem with the collectivism is that I have to join the collective. That's true, and it's tough luck. But the problem with the opposite of collectivism is that I have to be a part of your rat race, whereas I believe that the rat race is for rats, and the human race deserves better. So I can't really answer in detail your points. All I know is for sure, if you were a cleaner in Cuba, you'd be going to the ballet or the opera tonight, and you'd be able to afford to do so. Let's take the young woman in the middle.
Thank you so much. My name is Maria Londono. I'm coming from Spain. My question is, I saw how Raúl Castro signed up the free trade with European Union. Perhaps the Cuban system could be in the future a democratic system. What is your opinion about that?
Well, it depends what you mean by a democratic system. You see, I'm not sure we have the same definition of that. People in the United States and in Britain, amongst the powerful, would say that we have a democratic system. But I don't accept that. Democracy is about more than putting an X on a piece of paper every 4 years or every 5 years. If nothing changes when you put your X on the paper, then it's not much use to you. You can't eat the ballot paper. If you don't get a vote every 5 years, or not meaningfully, I mean, there's lots of votes and lots of elections in Cuba. In fact, there's a surfeit of participation in Cuba, endless participation. But I cannot create or join or stand for election as the pro-Miami party in Cuba. My freedom to do that is severely restricted. I'll end up in one of the jails that Charlie talked about. And if I take money from the United States to proselytize for closer relations with the United States, then I'll end up in jail. My freedom to do that is severely curtailed. The best way to chip away and eat away at those restrictions is to lift the blockade. And I say to Charlie entirely objectively, leaving aside his feelings and mine, the best thing you could do is lift the blockade. Then there will be no alibi. Then everything cannot be blamed on the blockade. Everything cannot be blamed on the Yankee imperialist aggressors. Everything will have to be judged and measured according to the reality. If you lift the blockade, you're more likely to get political change in Cuba than if you continue to apply it. But the beginning of your question is the big question. Of course, Fidel was out of power long ago. Almost a decade ago, he left power, 9 years. So on that level, nothing really changed with his death. But it's quite likely that there will be changes in Cuba when Raúl Castro steps down, as he is pledged to do later in 2017, at the Congress in 2017. There'll be a new generation of leaders. I don't know what direction they will choose. They might choose to be like Spain. They might choose to be like the United States of America. I hope they don't choose to be like Britain. But the point is, the choice will be theirs to make. I have stood with Cuba all these years, not so that I could tell them what they should do, but to defend their right to decide what they are going to do. And that, I'm sure, will never be relinquished by the Cuban people. They will never again become a bordello, a casino for the mafia in the United States. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. There were arguments and counter-arguments, whether Fidel Castro is right or wrong. Nobody is right. Nobody is perfect in the world other than God. My point is that maybe somebody is terrorist yesterday and nationalist today. Not only Fidel Castro, we saw Nelson Mandela, we saw Narendra Modi in India. So whether right or wrong, my question is, was Castro right about the US policy in Latin America, number one, and number two, will the Cuba resistance to United States sanctions be able to continue, although you have asked to lift the sanctions? Thank you.
Well, I believe they would be wise to lift the sanctions, but Cuba has already proved that it can survive US sanctions. And many things are actually much better. And this has been true in Iran and other places that have been sanctioned. It's true also in Russia now, under sanction. Sanctions definitely distort economic development, but they don't always distort it in a bad way. Cuba, for example, produced the vaccine for hepatitis B. They would not have done so if the Soviet Union had continued to exist and if the American embargo didn't exist. They would never have put their hands to the biomedical, biotechnological developments in Cuba, which are world famous now. If there's a vaccine ever produced for AIDS, it will almost certainly come from Cuba, not from America or Britain. They are miles ahead in these kind of fields that they would not have been if they were not under the kind of pressure that they are. Nobody grows food in Britain. Everybody grows food in Cuba. Every window box is growing tomatoes. Every piece of back garden, front garden, any piece of land is fructifying constantly. And I may say, I think that they probably do a bit of genetic modification too, because the tomatoes are very, very large and plump. Yes, madame.
Such things as either or no longer exist in our vocabulary as we used to use in the last century. And I believe the change of linguistics and how we are able to communicate multiculturally will be able to add, and add. So the achievements of Cuba for its own cultural restraints, historical context and so forth, as you're saying about the vaccine, are beautiful gifts to be shared with the world. Now, when we're looking at the borders as the existent reality, which hopefully will change soon, neither or any of the concepts we have ever generated before will suit us, because we have to come up with something new. We're able to communicate among all of us for the first time. So I'll go back to the point of communalism. I had and you said people have choices, and some people choose their children or their offspring or their years and years over having empathy and understanding what we are as us. I had the privilege of meeting some generals in Brazil during the dictatorship, but also someone in the UK who told me about agriculture. And very simply, he told me he does not believe that it's possible for us all to distribute or produce organic, fair trade, and so forth. Not because it's not possible via using scientists or people working together, because we have expertise from all over the world, but because he didn't believe in the human condition. And this is fundamentally what's behind all the political systems that we have, whether we have choices or not, criticism or not, is whether we believe in ourselves to be able to innovate and to create and pick all the stuff that work before in all different systems that we have currently. There's something that we can transfer into something useful for all the humans in the world. And having come to this point, we are finally able to have democracy in the world. And I think this is exciting. And when we look at Cuba being so small, and having given us so much to be proud of as people, then we can think of how this can take place. What this gentleman was saying is he knows, and he did that in confidence, and I'm very grateful for it. He says, as an advisor for many international organizations, as someone who have worked with agriculture, who knows the schemes in which you can apply to have grants to grow organic food and so forth, he will not do so. He will pass on to other rich people who have the capacity to apply for such grants. And I asked him why. And then he says simply because he doesn't believe in the human condition. He doesn't believe in himself.
No.
And he will feed his children himself food that he will never, not the one that he sells and grows because he knows that kills people. He will eat the organic food that other people grow, the crazy people. So there is something in us that once we believe together it's possible to take to the next level, and we look historically at little spots of great success in all different historical steps of our lives, we are able to gather the energy to take to the next stage.
Well, look, that's a very fine note. There's good and bad in everyone and in every society. Some of us believe we have two angels on our shoulders, one of them good and one of them not so good. It's true that there is a question mark about the human condition. But I just put it to you this way. There are 10 of us adrift in a boat in a shipwreck, and we have a limited amount of water and food. There are 3 ways that we can organize things. Either the richest among us will get the food and the water, in which case those who've got money will eat and drink, and those who have not will not. Although, in parenthesis, that will cause great instability in the boat, because the poorest of us will not watch the richest eating and drinking the remaining water. So it may be that the whole boat capsizes and we all drown. Or we can fight for the food and water, in which case the strongest will get the food and water. But there again, there will be instability in the boat. It will almost certainly overturn in the fighting, and all of us will drown. Or we can do the sensible thing, and we can agree amongst ourselves to share the food and the water equally. That's what they tried to do in Cuba. They have succeeded and survived all the vicissitudes of all the attempts to destroy them. That's what they have tried to do. With all the mistakes that have been made, all the things that could have been, should have been, ought to have been done or not done, they're still standing. They're still standing. No one will invade them. If the United States would be unwise to invade Iran, they would certainly be extremely unwise to invade Cuba. Cuba has survived. I put this to you as a scientific person. According to the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee cannot fly. Its body is too heavy, its wingspan too short, its wings too flimsy, but it flies, and a very beautiful sight it is too. According to the normal laws of politics and economics, Cuba should have collapsed long ago, but it's still standing. Hasta la victoria siempre, Comandante Fidel Castro.